a detailed analysis of all of this, I want to bring in Doug Blair now. He's a polling analyst and the author of the Blair Broadcast Substack. Doug, good to have you back with us, sir.
Thanks for having me on, Vince. Really appreciate it.
So if you had to pick a campaign to be with this week, just based on the numbers, it looks like President Trump does have a good head of steam.
Well, look, I mean, as you mentioned, this is still a nail-biter election. RCP probably has the most accurate, and it's 0.1% in favor of Trump, which is, I mean, it's a statistical tie. However, given the movement that we're seeing in the polls, given the momentum, Trump is the one that seems to be ahead. If you look at a sort of smorgasbord, a battery of these polls, they are starting to go in the direction where undecided voters who previously have said they weren't sure who they were going to vote for are now firmly breaking for Donald Trump. It looks as if Trump is gaining steam going into the election and Kamala Harris is losing it, which obviously a week and some change before the thing happens is the best place to be.
A lot of early votes have already come in. I think the New York Times estimate puts it at around 42 million nationwide. Are you reading into these at all?
I am. So we're actually seeing some relatively surprising trends. Whereas Democrats used to be the ones that were favored in early voting, we're actually seeing that flip where Republicans are seeing their gains go up in a lot of states that we weren't expecting, Nevada being one of those places where the early voting looks actually pretty solid for Republicans, which is just another sign, I think, that Democrats are going to be nervous because if you're looking at historical precedent, Democrats generally do pretty well with the early voting and the mail-in voting, but then Republicans come home on Election Day to vote in person. I don't anticipate that trend changing where people are still going to go in person to vote for Republicans. It almost seems as if what we're witnessing right now is Democrats just not voting. They're staying home, and therefore we're having a bonus from the early voting, the mail-in voting, and we will see that bump come Election Day, too. So, I think all the trends that we're looking at here are very, very positive for the Trump campaign. And you can see the Harris campaign trying to kind of struggle to adapt to it.
Yeah, there's also another piece that irregular and low propensity voters are showing up in some of this early voting data for President Trump. And all the Republicans who deal with this that I've talked to are very encouraged by that.
That is true. And again, one of those things that we have been seeing this election cycle is a lot of low propensity voters and Democratic voters moving more towards the right. So there was a hot tape of Kamala Harris and Gretchen Whitmer talking over a beer about we have to make up ground with male voters. You'll notice that phrasing was very specific. It wasn't white male voters. It wasn't black male voters, Hispanic male voters. It was male voters. We are now more than ever seeing a sex-based split in the polling data where if you ask people, well, who do you prefer, depending on the sex of the person, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their religion, well, all of it, it's basically Democrats get the women and Republicans get the men. And that is a trend that we have sort of just started to see evolve in the Trump era, where normally people have been kind of divided based on race, and now it's almost divided based on sex, which should be really interesting going forward.
Although when you talk about women in this equation, those are typically single college-educated women who fall into that category. And it's not married women by and large, which has led to a lot of really critical judgment from some corners of the left. Their position is it's so crazy. They're telling women you can keep your vote secret from your husband, as if they have the only reason they would vote for Trump is that their husbands are abusive. It's so disgusting, actually, Doug Blair.
I completely agree, Vince. And I think it's one of those things that Democrats are going to begin regretting, where, again, this idea of shaming men and shaming them and saying, oh, well, the only reason your wife is voting for this way is because you're abusing her into doing it. I don't really think that that's going to be the case here, especially, as you mentioned, it is single college-educated women that tend to break pretty hard for Democrats. But if they're married, women of all age groups and all ethnicities, again, tend to break for Republicans. So I think that we are really seeing here a new realignment of voters. So women of the single persuasion tend to go for the Democrats based on almost one particular policy area, which is abortion, whereas with Republicans, there's a larger policy portfolio that they can bank on: immigration, crime, the economy, foreign affairs. There seems to be a lot more there that they can capture.
Well, if you're wondering why Democrats are so interested in breaking up families, look no further than that data that you just shared with us. That's a really critical point. Hey, on the election itself, we're being served a huge number of headlines right now just about the way that these elections are being administered and whether or not they're going to be administered fairly. Today, we get a headline: Nevada's Supreme Court has rejected A Republican mail ballot challenge, says The Hill. Nevada's Supreme Court affirmed a lower court decision Monday, allowing mail ballots to be counted if they arrive without a postmark up to 3 days after the November 5th election. So, Doug Blair, what I'm looking at here is, first of all, how does mail even go without a postmark? How do you get a piece of mail that doesn't have a postmark on it? And you're going to take ballots up to 3 days after the November 5th election? Do these officials realize just how little trust voters will have in an election that's administered that way?
I think it's a great question to ask, Vince. And one of the things that we are looking at, too, is Republicans are very well aware of what things Democrats will try and do to make sure that this election's a little bit funky. We looked at last election where there were things in Pennsylvania where certain districts that tended to favor the blue candidate were allowed a longer period of time to cure ballots. And I think Republicans are aware that this is going to try and happen again. The question is, as you said, like, what is the thing that is going to make Americans trust the election process even more? And that is, obviously, mail-in ballots need to receive extra scrutiny. They need to arrive postmarked, and they need to arrive within the time frame of the actual election. None of this stuff where, 4 or 5 days after the election is concluded, all of a sudden we found 70,000 extra votes for Kamala Harris, and therefore she gets the state. I think that that's one of those things that Republicans must be aware of. They need to be paying attention, and there are organizations like the Heritage Foundation that have been obviously very much aware that these things are going to happen and prepared legal challenges in the case that things go wrong. But again, this is a very essential part of our democratic process, that people trust in the actual election.
Yeah, totally critical for that to take place. What has surprised you about the way this election map is composed right now and the winnable states? You know, I want to talk about Virginia, too, because Virginia, which is a state that I'd say that most people have left out of the conversation. We've talked about it a lot here, just with a lot of optimism. Maybe it could happen. I've seen a lot of energy in the Commonwealth of Virginia for getting Trump across the finish line. And we got a new survey today indicating that he is within 2 points. In fact, that's Rasmussen today. There was a survey last week that said Trump was back by 1. Rasmussen says today that Trump is just back by 2. That's really critical. And President Trump is going to be rallying right here in Virginia on this weekend. I believe it's Saturday, this weekend. What does that tell you?
Well, look, I mean, President Trump obviously thinks he can expand the map pretty heavily, and he's going into areas that are sort of very hostile to Republican candidates. Obviously, we just had this massive rally at Madison Square Garden in New York City, which is not anywhere near a friendly location for Republicans. But I think you're right that he's looking at the displeasure, let's put it mildly, at the current administration, the displeasure with the elites and all of these Democrats that say, well, if you just give us another chance, we'll fix the problem. And he's really capitalizing on that. Even Virginia, which is becoming more of a blue state, it's still relatively purple, but it's becoming more blue as each election cycle goes by. There's a pretty large disconnect between how President Trump might possibly do in the Commonwealth and how Hung Cao, for example, for the Senate might do. If we're looking at certain polling statistics here for Hung Cao, I think that Hung Cao is a very strong candidate, but Tim Kaine looks to be about 13 points ahead, which is going to be a really heavy lift. But as you said, Trump could theoretically do this. He could still win the state, which is, I think, that one of the questions you asked me is like, what's surprising me? Ticket splitting actually could have a large impact here, where Donald Trump at the top of the ticket might actually do better than certain senatorial and House candidates at the bottom of the ticket, which is an interesting kind of thought process that you would assume that people would generally vote Republican or Democrat down ballot. And we're seeing that people might be actually willing to split the ticket to vote specifically for Donald Trump.
Actually, it's funny you say ticket splitting. I noticed last night, I think I was watching one of the games last night, Larry Hogan is running a ticket splitting ad right now, which is like, look, I understand you may vote for Kamala, but for Senate, you can vote for Larry Hogan. Isn't that kind of fascinating? Like that's the point that he's reached.
Well, I mean, Larry Hogan, I think, is a very interesting case here, where he was so anti-Trump, and he's made his sort of campaign based on the fact that, like, oh, we're an old Republican and Trump is really bad. I don't think it's going to work. Obviously, I do hope that Republicans are able to keep the Senate. It seems like, looking at all of the polling data, it seems like looking at all the projections, that's almost a given. Montana and West Virginia seem pretty sure pickups for the Republican Party. That being said, I don't know if this is going to work, but if ticket splitting is going to be a thing. If people are going to say, I'm willing to split my ticket and vote for somebody at the top of the ticket that's different at the bottom of the ticket, it's entirely possible that people will be upset with how Maryland senatorial Democrats have done and how the Senate has sort of run when it's been run by Democrats, and we'll give Larry Hogan a chance. It will be really fascinating come Election Day to see how that pans out.
Listen to this. What's funny, because in the swing states, you basically have the Democrats tethering themselves to Trump, saying, well, I can work with Trump if he's the president. Here's how Larry Hogan's running in Maryland.
As a Democrat for president, I know who I'm voting for. That's easy. But Senate, also Brooks or Hogan? Look, they're both pro-choice, but Hogan cut taxes, tolls, and fees in Maryland. I like Hogan. He works with both parties. He finds common sense solutions. Also, Brooks would support her party 100% of the time, even their most extreme positions. This isn't complicated. I'm splitting my ticket. Harris and Hogan.
Holy cow. Oh, I'm sorry. I should play the end of it. It's
Larry Hogan, and I approve this message.
Yeah, he's like Harris and Hogan. What is this campaign?
Yeah. Very, very strange. But again, I think that this is one of the things that will be interesting to witness, because Maryland obviously is very clearly going to go to Harris. This is not in question. So it would be somewhat foolish for him to tie himself explicitly to Trump. But again, if this is going to be the election where that would work, I mean, he could very well have a chance. The polls that I'm seeing have him relatively decently within striking distance. It's not as close as obviously Montana or West Virginia, but it's possible.
Yeah. It's just unreal. I mean, I get it, like the wink, wink, like, hey, you can support me if you'd like, but the straight up the woman at the end of the ad, Harris and Hogan. Who put that in an ad? It's unbelievable. My goodness. Doug Blair, thank you for being obsessive with all the details. It really helps the rest of us. I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
That's
Thanks
Doug,
so much for having me on.
Of course, always. Doug Blair, polling analyst, author of the Blair Broadcast Substack.